As far as our business is concerned, I mean, mate, we've more than doubled the size of the business in this time, right? We've hired 20 people that I've never met because we hired them at a place where the whole country's in lockdown.
All right, everyone, welcome back to SALESBIZ. Before we kick off our episode today, you folks already know the drill. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and if you find value out of this specific episode, or you want me to bring on someone else, go ahead and drop a comment below. Today, my guest is an entrepreneur with decades of sales experience, working with global brands like Oracle, IBM, and now, after selling his first Salesforce consultancy to Blue Wolf, he's now the CEO of 8 Squad. Gentleman's busy. I'm excited. I'm thrilled to have him join us and talk about his journey coming out of the way from Sydney, Australia, Mr. Frank Cuiuli. Frank, welcome.
Thank you, brother. Nice to meet you, and thanks for having me on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the time, my friend. So let's kick it off, Frank. Tell us a little bit about your sales background and how you got into sales. I'm excited to talk about it.
Mate, I got into sales purely by accident. I was actually a professional martial artist in my early days, and I met a client just by sheer luck when I was doing, my part-time in retail, because back then martial arts didn't pay well, so I was working in retail, and I met a guy who owned a computer company and liked me and offered me a job, and that was just by absolute chance. I took the job and career in the tech industry. Failed dismally in my first couple of roles, but like every good martial artist, you get knocked to the canvas, you get back up and you keep going. That started my sales career.
Love it. What was your discipline? What martial arts did you study?
Mate, I studied more classical arts like Kung Fu systems from kind of Shaolin lineage, but I fought in kickboxing, I fought full contact karate, I held a few titles in full contact karate. I fought a few MMA bouts before it was really classified MMA, when it was still kind of underground, and that was an experience. But mate, I anything that had a ring and little protection, I pretty much threw myself into. But that was it was back. I'm 48 now, mate. This was when in my late teens, I had my first kind of semi-pro fight when I was 17, and it leads you into some pretty dark alleys that you don't want to be in as a young guy. So I had to choose a professional career, and that's kind of how it fell into computers, right?
I love martial arts. I grew up watching Van Damme. That was like my favorite guy. I know he's not like, oh my God, but those kicks.
Mate, absolutely. He's got to be a favorite. He's an entertaining guy.
And Steven Seagal, of course. That was my guy. I did a little Hapkido when I was a kid. Got all the way to the green belt, but then I got into high school and it wasn't cool to do karate anymore. So picked up some tips and tricks. But no, kudos to you. I feel like, that's that one sport where you could take on anything. You have that confidence because you feel like you could take on the world. You could beat anyone up. So might as well have a good conversation with them also.
No, I think you're right, man. I think the good thing it does, it sets you up with disciplines. And as you know, right, in sales, it's all about discipline and not getting scared to get punched in the face from time to time, with people saying no, right? And so I think, if anything, that's what my martial arts career set me up for, was just the kind of sheer grit that you have to succeed in the world of selling.
Yeah. Actually, funny you mentioned that. Every time we start a karate class, it was Hapkido Creed, number 1, self-respect, number 2, discipline, number 3, 100% effort. We had to say that every single time before we kick off the warm-ups. That's amazing. Well, I'm glad you're okay, because martial arts is one of those things too, especially MMA. I remember it started off without the 4-ounce gloves. It was
bare knuckle, man.
Yeah, I knew that chin of yours. I saw something right away. I'm like, this guy's a real deal. So that's a heck of a transition. Tell me, when you first got into sales, did you adopt some sort of you kind of fell into it. You had to put food on the table, though. What kind of sales methodology did you start following? What kind of training did you get?
Mate, funny enough, for the first kind of 5 years of my career, back then, it was still the Wild West. This was in the days of selling PCs, PCs were just a new thing. And so really you weren't given any support in terms of selling. It wasn't until about my fourth job where I really started to get trained in sales technique. And that was more in the retail space. Once I transitioned into the software industry through kind of a sidestep. I went into distribution where I got involved with software. That's when IBM kind of got into the e-commerce space, when Lou Gerstner came and, restructured the business and they started selling software. And I was in a I was working for one of their distributors, and I was a product manager for IBM. And they actually, I got exposed a lot back then to their selling methodologies, and that was when I really started to get anchored in a sales discipline, and that, so TAS was one of the very early ones I got exposed to, Spin, and strategic account selling. And they were good frameworks that I think I learned them at just the right time in my career, where I was still actively learning, right? I hadn't been set in a way yet. I was kind of around my mid-20s, and then those kind of methods carried me through. But it wasn't really until I got to I'd say Tibco was my first real enterprise sales role, and I'd spent 10 years in the industry by then. I went out and did my first startup, actually. So I left a role working for a IT software startup that we launched in Australia, and that was just around the whole September 11 thing happened. The world changed, so I went in and did my own gig, lost all my money, and then went had my ass kicked, and thought, well, I better get back to doing what I know. So went back into software selling, got a job at Tibco. And that's when I was really selling kind of those enterprise deals, large integration kind of opportunities, selling to the banks, selling to kind of the tier one corporations. And that's when I really started to put that sales philosophy to the test, right? And that was kind of, back in, about 18, 20 years ago now. And then it just kind of evolved from there for me.
I sold into the financial sector for 3 years. That was my target market. And those sales cycles, as you know, are brutal. Could be 12 months, could be 24 months sometimes. Legal and security reviews taking 6 months plus alone. How did you adopt the patience for that type of sale, Frank?
Mate, I think that's where, honestly, the martial arts kicked in. You just have a discipline, right? I really relied on the whole TAS kind of framework. So, I had to sell to one of the Australian banks, and this was when Tibco in Australia hadn't sold to the banks, and we were going after that whole banking market. So IBM owned it pretty much. All the retail banks, they were all blue accounts, and I just started with mapping out the organization, like literally. Who do we know? We know no one. Okay, great. Well, who can I get to? And then slowly putting names up on a big board. Literally I had a wall that looked like one of those, when the cops do, a crime scene investigation, they start to pin, people on the wall. It was looked like that. And so we started to build out that picture and slowly just having an action plan, right? Who do I have to get to? What have we learned? What's the politics? Who can we get? What influences can we get into the account? And slowly but surely built out that picture of contacts in the account. That took 6 months before I even had the smell of a deal. My boss at the time says, Frank, why are you wasting your time? Like, move on. I'm going, no, like, we can crack this. And a small opening came up in one of the divisions. And because of all that groundwork you'd done, we were just ready to jump. We won that small deal, and that was against IBM. And then that deal led to a bigger deal in the mothership, in a kind of the main corporate, and then basically that became one of our biggest accounts. So, it really is patience, tenacity, but also having a very clear vision of, the end point, right? What do you want to do? And investing your time in the right activities to kind of just nudge yourself towards success. And that really, it's grind, hustle and grind. That's it.
Yeah, not every salesperson is blessed to have a SDR, a sales development rep, to do all the deals for you and set up opportunities. I honestly think, Frank, I'm glad you said the whole cop analogy, because I feel like cops, in a way, we have to be detectives as
Yeah.
salespeople to put together strategies and find the right person to talk to. And that takes a lot of banging on doors and asking all sorts of questions. And you always get that door slammed in your face sometimes. So I'm glad you brought that up. I feel like cops are great salespeople too, if they take on the task.
Mate, I think you're right. I think the one thing the TAS framework really gave me, is that it's that whole political mapping. It's not like you got the formal structure, but it's like, who's really influencing who in this place? Who is who are the political circles? Where, because as you know, these big accounts, right? That's a moving target all the time, and I think that was probably one of the most useful methods that I think has stayed with me right throughout my career, even as a CEO, right? And when looking at building a business, that whole way of thinking has kind of stuck with me.
Yeah, absolutely. So after TIBCO, it looks like you spent some time at Oracle. I mean, talk about
Yeah.
the holy grail of sales, and it was around the type that things were blowing up too. So how
Yeah.
did, I mean, that's a very serious organization, huge engine. What was that transition like?
Mate, I got headhunted by one of their leaders. They just bought Siebel, right? This is the time that they just made the acquisition of Siebel. And the guy who was leading that at the time knew me because of a common ex boss, right? And he headhunted me and sold me the dream of, selling CRM to the boardroom and got me into Oracle. And so I went over there and did a small stint at Oracle. Oracle was a beast back then, as you said. It was like, heyday. It was growing. It was a big organization, and it was a lot of fun. I met a lot of great people. In fact, a lot of the people I met in the Oracle world today in the business I'm in around the Salesforce ecosystem are people who I'm dealing with, and so those relationships were quite valuable. But as a culture, I didn't gel with me. I didn't. I didn't kind of make a home there, unfortunately. Some people really sit well with those big enterprise organizations. For me, I always struggled with the bureaucracy of the big corporates. And I didn't know it was that until I made a few hops around where I realized, for me, those big enterprise software companies with bureaucracy and politics just didn't suit me, and I went, nah. And I opted out, and that's when I kind of went on to my next startup, after I left IBM, which was the second, big beast that I chose to enter.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Frank. I recently also, there was an acquisition that occurred I was at a startup, but then a big company acquired us. And I got to tell you, I mean, both amazing companies, great cultures, but the one is public, a lot more rules, bureaucracies, as you mentioned, politics, and it's just not for me. It just was not something that I was passionate about. So obviously I moved on. But no, I like the journey. I mean, it seems like you were taking all the right necessary steps in order to founding your own companies. But before we get into that, looks like you did a little had some sales director experience, sales manager experience. What was that transition like from going to an individual contributor and now you're responsible for salespeople? How did that transition work?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting change, right? Because the best player is not necessarily best coach. And for me, if it wasn't for the fact that I'd spent, by that time, almost 15 years in my own personal transformation journey, where getting to know who you are, what drives your behavior, pulling yourself apart. I think that would have been potentially a disastrous transition. So I think having the foundation for that transition was good. Plus, because I was naturally a coach, when I had martial arts schools, I trained people, and so you have a natural tendency to, teach and coach, and so the hardest thing was about shifting your identity from you being the star player in a field to you just being a servant in the team, right? And once I understood that, then everything kind of kicked into gear. But even that took a bit of time.
Did your sales reps find you intimidating as a martial artist that could literally just look at them the wrong way? Or
yeah, we had a bit of fun, mate. In one of my first early sales leadership roles, I was young, and I had a really young team of sales guys, and there was so much bravado, and so we used to have a lot of fun. I think one of the boys played a trick on me once and forecasted an absolute bullshit deal. It was non-existent, and he just did it as a prank. And I forecasted it to my boss, and then got caught out. And it was actually quite funny, because then I ended up going back to the center. They're all laughing because they knew they pulled it over me, and we had a vault. Our center we were selling PCs, and we were selling out of an old bank, right? So we had a vault in the back. And I said, right, Jules, get the gloves on. So we put the boxing gloves on, went into the vault, and then I punched him up as his reward for. I mean, you could never get that through HR these days, but it was actually quite funny. We had a good laugh, and mate, yeah. So I definitely used to use my intimidation as a tool, but yeah, that was in the early days of leadership. So yeah, got that out of me.
It sucks that that's the early days. I wish it was kind of like that now. I feel like sometimes that's kind of needed. That kind of getting that energy out, earning a little bit of more respect. I don't know. I'm for it. I wouldn't call HR on that, but these days we kind of live in a sensitive world as well. I did a little boxing. I did a little boxing in high school after my martial arts. Got into kickboxing as well. I never competed. I'll be honest, Frank, I don't like hurting people. That was my only thing. It's like, if I'm going to kick someone's ass, they either said something bad about my mom or they hit me first, something along those lines. But I was never a fighter. But one thing I tell every sales rep to this day, I have a punching bag right behind me right now. Yeah. I think that is, it's not a recommendation. It's a prescription to have that in sales. Have a punching bag somewhere. Because when you get told no, when they go to your competitor, they don't pick up your phone, you just want to punch something sometimes. And instead of punching your employees, maybe you hit the bag a few times. It serves me really well. So I couldn't agree with you more.
I can tell you, punching employees can be fun and satisfying. But hey, you don't want to do that too often.
I love how you guys roll in Sydney, man. In San Francisco. Oh, wow. That would be
hey,
a
man,
story.
let me tell you. So one of my sales guys now, I actually think the photo's probably still on LinkedIn. I had my offsite with my team, and one of my young boys, one of my sales guys, is a boxer. And so I said, bring your gloves down. And he got one on me, and he gave me a great shiner. And I said, mate, what company can you punch your CEO and give him a black eye and actually survive? So it was a fantastic offsite, to say the least.
I don't think you could even do that at Tidal or UFC or anything like that. If you punch Dana White, you're probably getting arrested. So kudos to you, my friend. Love it. So let's talk about your founding experience now. You did well in sales, you did well as a manager, and now you started your own company. What inspired you to do that, Frank? Was that always on the roadmap, or is that just something that you, through your experience, decided to do?
Look, it was a natural project. When we co-founded the first business, Veltio, with a few guys, it was kind of a natural thing. We were all at the point of our careers saying, look, let's stop whinging about our employer. Let's start something and make the company that we'd love to work at. And that was a great experiment and a great outcome. We built that business in 3 years and sold it. And it was a good exit. We built a business that was a rocket ship, and we were just fortunate enough to be right place, right time, and get acquired by Bluff at the time. For me, that was a great lesson, because, going into becoming kind of business owner, very different challenges, very different pressures. And so certainly, and I'd been through major loss in my first, startup failure. And so I wore the scars of that. And I think it was a really good opportunity to go back and just do it again. But this time we had a successful outcome. Funny enough, I went out of that high, and as most entrepreneurs do, you throw yourself into the next one. But the next one was more passion driven, which is a real big mistake for entrepreneurs. And I went back into the health space, that kind of, which was my very early origins in martial arts, learning about mind, body, and health. And I actually opened up another startup, which was in the health space, which is a whole different game. Once you're in health, you've got regulatory frameworks you've got to operate in. You've got a whole lot of different challenges, and unlike a consulting business or a software startup that you can be quite lean, the capital requirement for one of those businesses is very high. And so, I had my ass kicked in that one, invested pretty much everything I'd made in the previous one and lost it all. And that was actually really an interesting experience, an interesting journey for me, right? And so it was just fortunate because at the time I was doing some high performance work for a few clients, and one of those clients that I was helping their team, their sales team, through some kind of, maintaining high performance states. He's a good friend, knew me from my Oracle days, actually, from when I worked at Oracle. I did a deal with his company at the time. And he says, Frank, we're about to buy a Salesforce consultancy. Would you come in and be the CEO? And that's what led to 8 Squad. It was a time when I was literally winding down this startup, and that's a painful process for any entrepreneur, right? Having to, shut the door and pretty much something you put your life into for, a certain amount of years. And then basically rolled straight into 8 Squad and started again. Took basically a business which was at that time about 15 people, and took it to where it is, today. We're pushing 50 people. This is, 18 months later, through COVID, right? 12 months in this kind of COVID space. And it's been a great journey, and I guess the opportunity to kind of revise how we did it the first time and improve, right? Just do it better again and again. So, and even taking the losses, taking the learnings from the losses of the health business and saying, right, how do we not repeat those mistakes? So it's been an interesting journey, man.
Yeah, the health business is tough. I mean, you have HIPAA compliance, CFR Part 11. Sometimes you have all these other regulatories, as you mentioned. It's my uncle owns a medical supply business I spent some time in my early years, and from insurances to visits to audits, I mean, it's a nightmare. It's very beneficial and it's very profiting, but it goes a lot of work into it. So I completely understand you there. It looks like you did some neurophysics education. I was going to ask you about that. Is that what entailed within that specific startup, or was that just another passion project?
No, that was a core of it. So I went back to study before I did the startup, and I was trained as a neurophysics therapist. So it's really understanding the intersection between kind of movement and the nervous system, and using that as a mechanism to do high-end rehabilitation. And so I was a practicing therapist, and that was a very different space to be in, man, right? Like, when you start going to that therapeutic mode where you're dealing with people with high level trauma, it's a very different skill. And, actually with a salesperson, very counterproductive, because in sales, we get taught about being empathetic, connecting with the client. And when you're doing that at a therapist level, it's actually really dangerous for you, because you end up actually almost suffering your own trauma because of you're so closely coupled with your patients. And I found, mate, that wiped me out. Like, I'd have weeks after doing therapies with people where I'd just be absolutely spent, because meant that coupling with your client and feeling their trauma and going through their pain without putting that barrier up, it's very tough. I take my hat off. I take my hat off to anyone who's doing work in that trauma space. Like, it's hard work. And whilst it's very satisfying, look at the results we got for people, people with brain injury, getting them out of wheelchairs, walking again in record times. And I mean, very rewarding from a passion perspective, but hard work and very costly to operate a facility like that. And that's what brought us under, because we couldn't get access to the allied health in Australia. We had to you have to get access to tick a box, right? What type of therapy are you? Oh, we haven't heard of this one before. So there's no box to tick. So then you got to go create the box. And that's, millions of dollars later, we still couldn't achieve that goal. And I had to, wind it up in the end.
Yeah. I will tell you, when I worked for my uncle, that's what really discouraged me is I was talking to a lot of sick people all the time. Mm-hmm. People in wheelchairs. I mean, he sells anything from wheelchairs to those scooters to bath equipment, stuff like that. And what I can't ever get out of my head was a mother wheeled-in her son who had spina bifida and then also developed cancer. And he's like 16 years old, and I was 16, and that's basically my, we share the same age. And I was like, wow, this world is cruel, and I don't think I could do something like this. So that's why I decided, told my uncle, like, look, I'll help you any way I can. This is a family business, I know, but I just can't do this job for forever. So my hat goes off to not just you for taking on that journey, but every medical professional out there, especially right now with everything that's happening. And we'll get into COVID later, but I think it's the toughest job in the world, to be honest. Like trying to heal someone using whatever means they can, but dealing with those emotions as part of it. My hat goes off. I feel like I'm one of the strongest people I know, but that's one thing I would never in my life ever try to tackle.
Yeah.
Yeah,
man, I agree. Another level of respect for those practitioners, because it is tough. And I know you get it, because I can see it in your eyes, and that story you said, I totally get it, because that's exactly the experience I had. And until you've done that, you really don't understand what it's like dealing with that kind of client, who's looking to you as a lighthouse that you can make my life better, and then taking on that responsibility, which as a therapist you really shouldn't. You should learn to, and that's the lesson, right, that those therapists go through. But man, I also take my hat off to them. That's hard work.
Not to beat too much on this one, but is that something you attracted because something happened in your personal life, or someone you knew experienced something like that, or is that just a big problem you saw in the market in general that you were trying to solve?
I started actually focusing on a kind of area of high performance, not rehab. So looking at how do we train people to be able to sustain high performance states. And I look at it because what I saw in corporations, that people were operating outside of their capability, and they were burning themselves out. They were becoming depressed. They were using drugs, alcohol to kind of, manage their state. And I saw this, and I saw that from a technology perspective, digital disruption was actually pushing people beyond their coping mechanisms, because, we're always on, right? You don't know how to turn off anymore, and you got to go. And so I actually wanted to fix that. And so that's where it started. But because neurophysics and the work that we're doing was really well suited for high-end trauma, we just end up doing we kind of slipped into that. And corporates weren't ready for the kind of holistic framework that I was trying to basically bring to market, because people were still very much, oh yeah, we've got a well-being strategy, and that's bullshit. Most people just have tick boxes. We got yoga available. We give people, clean meals, or, we give them gym memberships. That's nothing, right? And so most corporates I was dealing with, it was too early on in the journey to help them understand what a high performance program. We just presented with an opportunity to work more on these trauma patients. So we kind of went down that path. And so that was by fluke. It wasn't really by design. That's what the therapy was really good at fixing. So coming back into the industry now, I've just taken all those learnings, because that's what we've done at 8 Squad. We've put in place a proper, holistic high performance framework for developing our people, for, helping them understand how to deal with stress, understand how to deal and sustain a state of high performance, that it's, not this constant thing. You've got to have recovery. You've got to, You've got to have self-inquiry. You've got to constantly be looking at how you're sleeping, how you're eating, how you're moving. And so, 8 Squad's actually given me the opportunity to prove my thesis of what we were trying to do in that business, which is great. It's the bridge between both worlds for me.
Got it. Yeah. Hats off to you, my friend. So 8 Squad, let's talk about that. Salesforce consultancy. You're still doing something like you did with the previous company, but I want to hear more about the actual company and the value prop that you're putting in the market.
So for 8 Squad, it was really about 2 things. Yeah, what do we do differently? And that's really about our people, our values, our culture. Yeah. And so, we've got fundamentally what I think is, world-class in terms of our 8 Squad Academy in how we develop better humans, right? Because that's what work's about now. Like the divide between personal life and work life is gone. So if we're going to spend so much time with people, let's really do everything we can to develop them as humans, not just, assets for corporate use, right? And then from a customer perspective, let's look at this problem around digital disruption again, but take it from a human-centered outcome point of view. So how do we actually make the lives of our customers better through the use of digital, right? And how do we actually help our customers and their customers through that change process? Because it's different, right? And there are different issues that come up when we start looking at innovation and automation as a theme that we're trying to deliver. And that's what I think a lot of people underestimate, that, when we take our customers through a transformation journey, that's a stressor. That's going to create stress so how do we manage that? How do we do that in a more positive way?
So 8 Squad, do you have a target market that you're working with right now?
Yeah, we have a few kind of verticals. So we go after financial services. We do a lot in the fintech space, helping these new fintechs kind of build their businesses, build the platforms for them. Obviously, I've gone back into health, trying to help the health industry modernize and be more patient centric, and kind of deal with regulations, but in a manner which keeps their patients at the center of the experience. So they're big markets. Government for us is now emerging. We have traditionally done a lot of government work, but when you've got these global pandemics, governments tend to spend more, and so we've moved more into that government space. And then probably the only other major market we now starting to also emerge is kind of in that MRD, manufacturing, retail, distribution, and that's kind of areas where you see a lot of retailers now reinventing themselves through digital manufacturers. I think COVID's really tested the whole global supply chain, right? So now you've got countries having to respond to that and go, well, maybe it's not such a good idea just to give everything to China, right? And that's what we're seeing. So yeah, they're the kind of key industries that we kind of have, our vertical squads focused on.
Got it. And is this a Australian-based company, but do you have other offices around the world? Is that kind of the goal to expand out?
Yeah, look, hopefully we don't get bought before we get a chance to go international. Who knows? Maybe it's through an acquisition we're going to get international. But definitely mastering Australia is the first step. Get scale here. With the current restrictions on travel, especially international, it's probably a good time just to focus on a domestic market for a while. And then, start looking at, more global expansion. We definitely had that in mind when kind of ramping this business up. But to be honest, man, like I've got so much room just for domestic growth right now in our business, that I think the next 12 months will just really cement in, that local growth, and then start looking at, Asia or the US or the UK. Just that's going to also depend on the state of your own economies and markets.
Now, with respect to COVID, crazy time we're living in, Frank, how has that impacted your business? And tell us a little bit about the politics that are happening Australia right now around it.
As far as our business is concerned, I mean, mate, we've more than doubled the size of the business in this time, right? we've hired 20 people that I've never met because we hired them at a place where the whole country's in lockdown. It presented different challenges for us. It was more about how do we look after our people, right, and their mental health during this time. As a marketplace, it's been interesting. It's definitely impacted certain verticals more than others. We're lucky we didn't have exposure to like entertainment and airlines, who obviously copped it quite significantly. So some other companies we know who had big exposures in those industries, it impacted them quite seriously. Our markets were quite bullish. So, fintechs were still spending. Like I said, government was ramping up. So our was able to sustain growth. And also our squad model allows us to pivot quick. So the way we make decisions as a business, it doesn't all have to come up to me. Like we empower people who are close to the ground, right, and close to the market, right, to make a call and decide on where they need to shift their focus. And so having that model actually really helped us adapt quick to things that were needed in market. So we've done quite well. We've stood up quite strongly in these difficult times. It's going to be interesting coming into the new year what the general sentiment is. I think as an economy, as a community, we've gone, all right, this thing's going to be around, but we're not going to stop living. So how do we adapt, right? How do we do good track and trace? How do we isolate this thing when it bubbles up and rears its head again? And I think we're getting better at that. And because of that, I think businesses are realizing, well, I can't stand still. And I think 2021 going into next year is going to be very interesting. I see a lot of projects which are going to come back online because I think the general means, well, we just got to get on with it now. And so I think next year is going to be a really good year. And we're certainly seeing the makings of that at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a crazy time we're living in, but I'm glad you're thriving. As you said, all marketplaces, domestic, your territory, US. It's a lot of unknowns as well, where things are headed and what direction. So I'm glad your business is doing well, at least. That's refreshing to hear. And one more question for you, Frank. Actually, two more, excuse me. Where do you see yourself as a CEO in the next couple of years with the company? How do you feel like that's going to evolve overall?
Look, me personally, I'd love to continue growing it and having a blast. But our shareholders will make that decision, and look, whatever it is, it'll be the right thing. I'm a big believer, it'll just, whatever it is, whether we grow it organically and get the chance to spread our wings internationally, or whether it happens through an acquisition, as long as it's good for the people, right, then it's good. When we sold to Blue Wolf, I mean, that was an awesome acquisition, and it presented our people with great opportunity, and then they sold to IBM, right? And so for me, it's a journey, and everything that happens in that journey is an opportunity for your people. And I think if you prepare your people well, and they're growing, regardless of how, right, it's going to be a good outcome. And so mate, yeah, I'd love to stay and keep building, but we'll see what happens in the next 2 years,
Absolutely. And last question for you, Frank. Have you seen the movie Back to the Future before?
Yes, I have.
So you have a time machine, you jump in and you go see your 18-year-old self. What do you tell that younger Frank Cuiuli?
Mate, what I tell him is strap yourself in, pal, because it's going to be a hell of a ride, and take all the good and take all the bad, because it's the bad that's going to harden you up and it's going to prepare you for the good, and that'd be all I'd tell him.
Absolutely. Well, I think your fists of iron, your iron fist hardened you up too. So kudos to you there. Frank, really appreciate you taking the time, my friend. It's been great getting to know you. Once again, I'm enamored with everything that you've accomplished, not just on the software as a service side, but specifically on the medical side too. I think regardless of what happened with the business, I think you gave a lot back, and kudos to you for taking that initiative. Please stay in touch and stay healthy, my friend. Can't wait to see what else you have in store in this future.
Thanks, Mike. Nice talking to you, man.
You too, brother. Take care of yourself.